Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Thanks for joining me today. I'm getting back in the groove of everything. I'm feeling good about these videos. I hope you do too. Today's story is wild. It involves murder, magic, a possibly cursed house, and a record-setting court case. This case was so monumental that it was written into a best-selling novel, which later turned into a feature film. Let's get into it. First, I'm going to introduce you to our setting, which is Savannah, Georgia. Is there anything more dramatic than the South? The hanging moss, the steamy air, the cobblestone streets, the accents. The Mercer Williams house was designed for Confederate General Hugh Weedon Mercer. Fun fact, he is the great-grandfather of singer-songwriter and co-founder of Capitol Records, Johnny Mercer. The house was designed by an architect named John S. Morris. It is 3 stories tall, 7,000 square feet, and takes up an entire city block. Construction for the Mercer Williams house began in 1860, but was put on pause for the Civil War. General Mercer was imprisoned and put on trial for the murder of 2 army deserters. He was eventually released due in large part to the testimony of his son, but he left prison a very bitter and angry man. He lost everything and would have to sell his house, and the new owners completed the construction. The house was completed in 1868 by its new owner, John Wilder. So no one with the name Mercer ever actually lived in the Mercer Williams house. Over the following years, the home would see various owners, including the Savannah Shriners. The home would eventually be abandoned for 10 years until it found a new owner in 1969, and we'll get to that in just a moment. In 1969, before a man named Jim Williams actually purchased the house, it was abandoned and a little boy named Tommy Downs entered the property to go pigeon hunting. This story would unfortunately end in tragedy because while Tommy was either on the roof of the house or the balcony, he ended up falling onto a wrought iron fence with spikes, and unfortunately he could not be saved. And a really creepy fact about this is that spike that Tommy landed on had to be broken off and it was never replaced, so you can still see where it was today. So that same year, antique dealer and preservationist Jim Williams ends up purchasing the house. Jim was a Sagittarius, born and raised in Georgia. He was very active in the preservation of the Savannah Historic District. In fact, by the time he was only 24 years old, he had already bought and restored 3 historic Savannah homes. He was 39 years old when he bought what was then known as the Mercer House, and it only took him about 2 years to restore it to its former glory. After the restoration, the home became Jim's permanent residence. To celebrate his accomplishment, he threw this huge Christmas party in December of 1970. He invited all the members of Savannah's high society, and it was said that you could see candles lit in every window. It was a very fancy party, piano player downstairs, organ player upstairs, butlers walking around with silver trays, everyone in gowns and black tie. And this party would become an annual event which all of Savannah's high society looked forward to. You weren't somebody until you were invited to Jim Williams' Christmas party. He ran his antiques restoration business from his carriage house located behind the mansion. And inside the house, Jim had a wide variety of curiosities and antiques that he collected from around the world, including a cipher that belonged to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. So our guy Jim, he was what we like to call a sugar daddy. He would find young men that were struggling and invite them over to his house. And around 1979, Jim started to spend a lot of time with a young man named Danny Hansford. Danny was Jim's handyman and sometimes lover. He spent a lot of time at the house and essentially lived there, coming in and out of the house. Now, who was Danny? Well, Danny was 5'10". He had a tattoo of a Confederate flag and a marijuana leaf on his arm, and was said to be rarely, if ever, sober. In the movie later made about this case, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, Danny is played by Jude Law. Danny had a rocky childhood. His parents were very young when they had him and would end up getting divorced when he was only a year old. Later on, his father would die by suicide. His mother had mental health problems which led her to be hospitalized, and Danny would end up in and out of foster homes. Danny liked to skip school. He didn't really like attending, and he was said to only have an education at about an 8th grade level. He would end up getting in a lot of trouble and started experimenting with different drugs, and he was known to do sexual favors to support his habits. At one point, he was arrested for assaulting his mother, and he ended up being diagnosed with a personality disorder as well as unsocialized aggressive behavior. He eventually ended up enlisting in the Air Force Reserves, which sounded like it was an ultimatum given to him by a judge, which is weird to me. Like, he has an 8th grade education and a personality disorder and beats his mom. But let's give him a gun. Let's put him in the armed forces. Yeah. It only lasted about 6 months. He ended up getting discharged. He would continue to be arrested for petty crimes around Savannah, including an incident where he beat his neighbor with a chair. He was sent to a mental health facility where he was found to be homicidal and acutely psychotic. And around 1979, Danny was dating a girl named Debbie who lived in Savannah and was a bartender. Debbie would say that Danny had uncontrollable fits of violence where he enjoyed making people upset, and he assaulted Debbie on multiple occasions. On August 7th, 1980, Danny took 49 of Jim Williams' Libritrol pills and ended up having to be hospitalized, obviously. Jim's friends really tried to convince him just to drop Danny and stay away from him. They saw how bad he was and how much trouble he could cause Jim. But Jim would always make excuses for Danny. He bought him nice clothes and lent him money, and he tried to teach him the ways of high society. Like Danny was Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady. So, April 3rd of 1981. Danny comes by asking Sugar Daddy Jim for some money. An argument breaks out and Danny refuses to leave. Danny smashes one of Jim's antiques and leaves, or so Jim thinks. Danny had actually grabbed one of Jim's guns, and he appears in the bathroom doorway and shoots a hole in Jim's floor. Jim calls the police and Danny is arrested, but eventually Jim drops the charges. He just can't do that to Danny. Jim was always quick to forgive Danny, and he invited him on an upcoming trip he had to Europe to buy some antiques. But Danny refused because, he wouldn't be able to do drugs on a trip to Europe, so he had to stay home. He had to refuse. So according to Jim, on the night of May 1st, 1981, Jim and Danny go to a drive-in movie. Danny smokes 9 joints and drinks a half a bottle of whiskey. They go home, Danny starts playing some video games, and at one point there's a discussion. Jim's like, so since you're not going with me to Europe, you gotta stay home and do the drugs. I get it. But I'm gonna bring my other friend with me. Is that cool? This friend, his name's Goodman. Jim gives him a call around 2 a.m. He says, hey, I just talked to Danny about you coming to Europe with me. He's cool with it. Here, I'm going to put him on the phone. Danny gets on the phone. He's like, yeah, Goodman. No, it's fine. No hard feelings. It's cool. It's cool with me. And it seems like everything's cool, right? Danny, he's continuing to drink. And that whiskey? He continues to get angrier and angrier, and he's talking about his mom and his friends. He smashes the Atari. And Jim's like, all right, you gotta go. Of course, this escalates the situation, and Danny shoves Jim. Jim goes into his study and gets on the phone to call the police. But then Danny, again, grabs one of Jim's guns. Jim, where's your gun closet? Where's the lock and key? So then Danny's pointing the gun at Jim, and he allegedly says, I'm leaving this town tomorrow, but you're leaving tonight. And he fires the gun at Jim. The bullet grazes Jim's right arm. Jim then grabs the gun that he keeps in his desk drawer and fires the gun at Danny multiple times. Shortly after, Goodman receives another call from Jim. Jim's on the phone and he says, Goodman, you gotta come over. I had to shoot Danny. Jim calls 911 at 2:58 a.m. and reports the shooting. It was estimated that Jim waited about 30 minutes before he called 911. Danny was found lying face down with a pistol in his right hand, and he had been shot in the chest, the ear, and the back. Both guns that were used were part of Jim's antique collection. Police said that they followed standard procedure and placed bags on Danny's hands. Upon later examination, it was found that there was no powder residue on Danny's hands, which would have been there if he fired the gun. Jim was arrested for murder, and he got out on a $25,000 bail and remained at his home. On May 6th, the judge grants Jim permission to go ahead and go on his trip to Europe to collect his antiques. Jim is the only man in Georgia history to be charged 4 times for the same crime. During the first trial in 1982, presided over Judge George Oliver, Jim was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He appealed and posted the $100,000 bond. Jim's defense lawyer anonymously received a copy of the police report showing that the arresting officer had contradicted himself about the bullet hole in the floor at the Mercer house. Based on this evidence, the verdict was overturned in January 1983 by Georgia Supreme Court, and a new trial was ordered. Before his second trial, Jim hires a new high-end lawyer named Sonny Seller, but he also hires a root doctor named Valerie Bowles to put a curse on the prosecutor. John Berendt wrote about this case in his 1994 book, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. He wrote that he met Valerie with Jim in a Savannah graveyard, where she placed a spell on Spencer Lawton, the district attorney who had filed charges against Jim Williams. Valerie told Jim Williams, quote, "Now you know how dead time works. Dead time lasts for 1 hour, from half an hour before midnight to half an hour after midnight. The half hour before midnight is for doing good. The half hour after midnight is for doing evil. Seems like we need a little bit of both tonight. Valerie Bowles told Jim Williams that he needed to ask Danny for forgiveness, but Jim refused. So the second trial begins in September of 1983, and Jim's lawyer decides to have him openly bring up his sexuality. Not much else differed from the first trial, and Jim was found guilty again and sentenced to life in prison. In June of 1985, the Georgia Supreme Court overturned Jim's conviction, saying that the sheriff should not have been able to testify as an expert, and that the prosecutor waited until his closing argument to present evidence. So, we're at the third trial. This happens in the spring of 1987, and this one results in a mistrial. New evidence showed that Danny's hands were actually not bagged at the scene of the crime, which meant that his hands could have been wiped off in the time that they discovered him at the crime scene and by the time he was transported, which meant that there could have been gunpowder residue on his hands, but it was potentially wiped off in the transportation of the body. During deliberations, a juror supposedly called a paramedic to ask for his professional opinion, but this was not proven. After 2 deliberations, the jury could still not reach a verdict, and one woman said she saw that there was reasonable doubt and would not change her verdict. On June 9th, 1987, with 11-1 jurors in favor of a guilty verdict, it was declared a hung jury. The fourth and final trial, which was moved to Augusta, Georgia, resulted in Jim's acquittal in May of 1989, 8 years after his conviction and after just an hour long of deliberation. Deputy Kirkland, the district attorney who prosecuted Jim Williams at his first trial, remains adamant of Jim's guilt. He has written, "Did Williams kill Hansford? Of course he did. Was it a self-defense? Not even close. In fact, it's scientifically impossible for Williams to have been innocent of the crime." On January 14th of 1990, Jim Williams collapsed in his home after only 8 months of being a free man. He died of pneumonia and heart failure and was said to have died in his study at the same location of the shooting. His death was somewhat mysterious, but not to Valerie Bowles. She said, quote, "The boy did it." The Mercer Williams house is now open to the public. You can go there and have a tour. It is run by his sister, Dorothy. I read that Dorothy doesn't really like to talk about the murder on her tours. She likes there to be more talk about the history of the house and the antiques that are in the house. This house and the book and the movie Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil has brought a lot of tourism to Savannah, and a lot of people go to Savannah to see that infamous statue on the book cover and the movie cover, and just to be able to walk through this house that was home to such a notorious crime. This is an interesting case because it's not like a whodunit or any type of mystery. It's obvious that Jim was the killer, but the question is, could he have avoided this? Was it self-defense? I'd love to hear what you guys think about this case. Do you think Danny actually shot at Jim? Do you think it was self-defense, or do you think Jim had just had enough of Danny and took him out? It seemed like Danny was a pretty violent guy and this was almost inevitable, like he was a ticking time bomb. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.